It was just past 11 on a Tuesday night in February when Marcus Webb saw something standing at the far end of the bridge that made him take his foot off the gas without deciding to. He was driving home from a late shift, alone, on a 2-lane stretch of County Road 9 outside a small town in southeastern Ohio. Crossing the old iron truss bridge that spans Sycamore Creek, his headlights caught it first as 2 points of reflected light, low to the ground, at the edge of the guardrail. Then the shape underneath them resolved, tall, upright, standing with a stillness that no deer, no person waiting for a ride, nothing he could immediately name, would hold in the middle of a February night on an empty bridge. He said later that his first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. His brain kept trying to fit what he was seeing into something ordinary: a hitchhiker in a heavy coat, a road sign at a strange angle, a trick of his own headlights against fog. None of those explanations survived more than a second or two of actually looking at it. He said the strangest part, in hindsight, wasn't the shape itself but how long it took his mind to admit that none of his guesses were working. By the time he'd slowed the car to a crawl, hands tight on the wheel, the shape had turned, not fled, not startled, just turned, unhurried, and stepped off the edge of the bridge into the dark tree line above the creek bank. Gone before he'd fully processed what direction it had gone. Marcus didn't stop. He drove straight home, sat in his driveway for almost 10 minutes before he could make himself go inside, and didn't tell anyone what he'd seen for almost 2 weeks. He said part of the delay was practical. He genuinely didn't know how to describe it without sounding like he was either joking or losing his mind, and part of it was a quieter reluctance to make the thing feel more real by saying it out loud. When he finally did tell someone, a coworker, half joking, testing the story out loud before he trusted it enough to say seriously, the response he got back stopped him cold. "That's the third one this winter." This is the story of what happened on that bridge outside a small Ohio town over one winter, 3 separate drivers, at 3 separate times, describing the same thing, none of them aware the others existed until after the fact. Before we get to how those 3 accounts came together, you need to understand what came first, because the order those sightings happened in the woods is not the order most people ended up hearing about them. The first report, chronologically, came in early December, nearly 10 weeks before Marcus Webb's encounter, from a woman named Patty Ruiz, a home health aide who drove that same stretch of County Road 9 almost every night on her way to a late client visit. She'd made that drive, by her own estimate, close to 1,000 times over the 6 years she'd worked that particular route. Enough that she said she could probably drive it with her eyes closed. Which made what happened that December night stand out all the more sharply against the routine. Patty's account was less dramatic in the telling but, in some ways, more unsettling in the details. She didn't see a full figure clearly. What she saw, in the beam of her headlights as she came around the bend before the bridge, was something crossing, fast, low, covered in what she described as dark, matted fur, moving on 2 legs but hunched forward, closer to the ground than an upright human posture would allow. It crossed the full width of the road in what she estimated was 2 or 3 strides and disappeared over the guardrail on the far side before she'd even fully registered what she was looking at. She slowed down out of instinct rather than curiosity, glanced toward where it had gone, and saw nothing, no movement in the brush below the bridge. No sound over her own engine and the wind. She said the whole encounter lasted maybe 2 seconds, and that for weeks afterward she genuinely believed she'd seen a large dog or coyote moving strangely. Right up until she heard about what Marcus had seen. She admitted later that part of why she settled so quickly on the coyote explanation was simple comfort. It was a story she could live with. And the alternative wasn't. Patty told her sister about it the same week it happened, mostly as an odd anecdote, a large, weird-looking animal crossing the road at night. Nothing more. Her sister didn't think much of it either, mostly asking whether Patty thought it might have been rabid, a question Patty said she couldn't really answer given how briefly she'd seen it. Neither of them connected it to anything until months later. The second sighting came in mid-January, about 5 weeks after Patty's and roughly a month before Marcus's. This one came from a teenager named Cody Fenwick, 17 years old, driving home from a basketball game with 2 friends in the car, which matters here. Because unlike Patty and Marcus, Cody's account had 2 additional witnesses in the vehicle with him at the time. Witnesses who, notably, were interviewed separately afterward and never given the chance to simply agree with whatever Cody said first. All 3 of them described the same core details independently when later asked separately. Something standing at the edge of the bridge as they approached. Tall, Cody estimated at least 7 feet based on where its head sat relative to the guardrail height, which he knew because he leaned against that same guardrail countless times fishing under the bridge as a kid, and motionless until their headlights swept across it, at which point it moved toward the tree line in what one of the friends described as too smooth, too controlled, for something startled or panicked. Cody didn't slow down. If anything, he said, he sped up, and none of the 3 boys spoke about it again until they were already 3 miles down the road. At which point all 3 started talking over each other, each one confirming details the others had seen, each one relieved to hear the others had seen the same thing rather than worrying they'd imagined it alone. One of the friends later said that particular moment, everyone talking at once, each one afraid to be the only one who saw it, was almost more unsettling than the sighting itself, because it meant there was no comfortable explanation left where only one of them had imagined it. Cody told his father that same night. His father, by his own later account, assumed initially that the boys had seen someone in a costume, or a prank set up by other kids from a rival school, a theory that made enough sense at the time that no one thought to report it anywhere official. And it might have stayed a private family story if not for what happened a month later. He said he even considered, briefly, driving out to the bridge himself the next day to look for any sign of a costume or prop, but never got around to it, and by the time the 3rd sighting surfaced, whatever might have been left to find was long gone. It was Marcus Webb's coworker, the one who told him, "That's the 3rd one this winter," who actually connected the dots. She was a regular in a local community Facebook group focused on the small town's goings-on. Mostly lost pets, yard sale listings, and school announcements, and she remembered a post from back in January where Cody's father had, almost as an offhand joke, mentioned his son and his son's friends being spooked by something on the County Road 9 bridge. She'd also, separately, heard through a mutual friend about Patty's odd encounter with what Patty had assumed was a strange acting coyote back in December. When she heard Marcus's account and recognized the same bridge, the same general description, tall, upright, unhurried, gone into the tree line by the creek, she put the 3 stories in front of him and watched him go quiet in a way she said she wasn't expecting from someone who, up to that point, hadn't taken the whole thing especially seriously. She said Marcus read through the details twice before saying anything at all. Once the connection was made, the details lined up in ways that made simple explanation harder rather than easier. All 3 accounts placed the creature at the same specific structure, not just the same general road, but the same bridge, within a few hundred feet at most, out of a stretch of county road that ran nearly 11 miles. All 3 described a similar height estimate, well above 6 feet, when height was estimated at all. All 3 described a distinct manner of movement, described variously as unhurried, deliberate, or too smooth when it left, rather than the panicked bolt you'd expect from most wild animals caught in headlights at close range. And all 3 sightings happened at night, within a 2-hour window of each other across the different dates, between roughly 10 and midnight, despite Patty, Cody, and Marcus having no overlapping schedule, no shared route beyond that specific stretch of road, and, prior to the Facebook group connecting them, no knowledge that the other sightings had happened at all. The bridge itself has a history that, depending on who you ask, either adds context or is simply local color layered onto 3 unrelated sightings after the fact. Sycamore Creek Bridge, as it's known locally, was built in the 1930s. A steel truss structure that's outlasted several attempts by the county to replace it with something more modern, mostly due to budget constraints rather than any particular effort to preserve it. It sits at the bottom of a wooded ravine, flanked on both sides by several hundred acres of largely undeveloped forest that connects, eventually, to a much larger state wildlife area a few miles to the north, genuinely remote terrain by the standards of that part of Ohio, with limited hunting pressure and minimal human foot traffic outside of deer season. Longtime residents, when asked, offered a mix of reactions. Several older locals mentioned, almost in passing, that the bridge and the creek below it had a loose reputation for being off long before that winter. Nothing specific. No established local legend with a name attached the way some regions have. Just a vague, second-hand sense passed down that people didn't love stopping there after dark. The kind of low-grade folklore that exists around a lot of rural bridges without ever crystallizing into a full story. One older resident recalled her own father refusing to fish that stretch of creek after dark decades earlier, though she admitted she'd never asked him why, assuming as a kid that it was simply about copperheads or uneven footing near the water. No formal investigation happened, in the sense that no wildlife agency or law enforcement body opened any kind of case. Patty never reported her sighting to anyone official, having initially explained it away herself. Cody's father, even after hearing about the other 2 accounts, didn't see much point in contacting local police about something with no property damage, no injury, and no crime to speak of. Marcus considered calling the county sheriff's non-emergency line, he said, but talked himself out of it, unsure what exactly he'd be reporting or what anyone could realistically do about it. The closest thing to an official response came informally, through a retired county extension officer with a background in wildlife management who Cody's father happened to know socially. When told the details, the height estimate, the bipedal movement, the location, his response was, by all accounts, cautious. He noted that black bears, while uncommon but not unheard of in that part of Ohio in recent years as the state's bear population has slowly rebounded, can occasionally stand and move on their hind legs for short distances, particularly when investigating something at ground level or moving through brush. But he also noted that sustained bipedal movement, of the kind all 3 witnesses described, over the several strides each account included, would be unusual even for a bear, and that a black bear standing fully upright rarely approaches or exceeds 6 feet. Well short of the height Cody and his friends estimated. He didn't offer an alternative explanation. He simply said, in Cody's father's recollection, that he wouldn't rule out a bear entirely, but it wouldn't be the tidiest explanation, and left it there. Cody's father said he appreciated the honesty of that answer more than he would have appreciated a confident guess either way. Skeptics of the story point out, reasonably, the limitations baked into every account. None of the 3 sightings produced a photograph or video. All 3 happened too quickly, in low light, from a moving vehicle, for anyone to think to grab a phone in time. Height estimates made in the dark, from inside a car, under stress, are notoriously unreliable, and even trained observers routinely overestimate the size of something briefly glimpsed an adrenaline charge. The 2-hour nightly window across all 3 sightings, while notable, could plausibly reflect nothing more than when that stretch of road sees the most late-evening traffic in the first place, rather than any pattern tied to the sightings themselves, and the psychological effect of hearing someone else's account before forming your own memory of a brief, confusing event is well documented. Once Marcus knew about Patty and Cody's stories, his own memory of what he saw may have unconsciously reshaped itself to match. Some skeptics go further, suggesting that a widely circulated post in a small local Facebook group is itself capable of shaping how people frame ambiguous memories after the fact, not necessarily inventing something that wasn't there. but sharpening a vague impression into a more specific, more dramatic shape once a compelling narrative is available to borrow from. Those who take the accounts more seriously push back on a few of those points. They note that 3 independent witnesses, including 2 of the 3, Patty and the original 3 boys, who told their stories well before knowing anyone else had seen anything, which rules out the kind of contamination skeptics point to in Marcus's case, describing convergent, specific details about manner of movement and approximate height is a harder coincidence to wave away than a single ambiguous account. They also note that the specific location, not just the general road, held across all 3 sightings, which a purely random pattern of misidentified wildlife would be less likely to produce with this kind of consistency. And they point out that Patty's account, in particular, actually differs in some details from the other 2, hunched and fast rather than tall and unhurried, which they argue makes coincidental influence less likely. Not more, since a story simply borrowed from someone else's account would probably line up more neatly rather than less. No one has reported seeing anything at Sycamore Creek Bridge since that winter. At least not that has surfaced publicly. Cody still drives that road occasionally, though he says he doesn't linger on the bridge the way he used to as a kid. Fishing off the guardrail on slow summer afternoons, Patty changed her route for a while afterward, adding an extra 10 minutes to her nightly drive, before eventually going back to the direct way out of simple convenience. Though she says she still slows down, every single time, as she comes around that bend before the bridge. Marcus Webb, for his part, says he thinks about it less as a monster story now and more as a genuinely unanswered question. 3 people, on 3 different nights, seeing something they couldn't identify, at the same specific spot, in a stretch of remote forest big enough and empty enough that whatever it was could have simply moved on, or could still be out there, using that same wooded ravine the way it apparently did that winter. Unseen and unbothered, waiting for the next set of headlights to sweep across the guardrail at the wrong moment.